Hi, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that ACMI and RMIT University respectfully acknowledge Indigenous ancestors and elders, past and present, and that we acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. I know we're conducting this session online, scattered across Victoria and maybe even other states. I'm personally speaking to you from Melbourne's inner north on the land of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And I think it's important to recognize we conduct this business on their unceded territory. Indigenous sovereignty has never been extinguished. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Douglas Wilson. I'm a lecturer at RMIT University's Bachelor of Game Design program and also co-owner of the Danish game studio Die Gute Fabrik. We've been running this annual Games Talk series for a few years now, and this year we're very excited to co-host with our friends at ACMI. It's a bummer we can't run this in person, but the upside is that we get to put these talks on the internet for the whole world to watch, which is cool. A big thank you to all the ACMI staff for running all the infrastructure to get this up online. I will be hosting today's session and a couple of the later Monday sessions, and the ACMI staff will be hosting the other sessions. This series will be running every Monday at 6 p.m. Melbourne time through September 28th, and these sessions will also be recorded. We will be taking some questions from the live YouTube chat towards the end of the session, so feel free to write your questions there. Okay, on to today's session, the very first session of the 2020 series. Today, we are very pleased to welcome not one, but two representatives from Melbourne game studio House. Jake Strasser and Nico Disseldorp, here with us today, are members of House, along with Michael McMaster and Stuart Gillespie-Cook. They are the creators of the video game Push Me Pull You, released in 2016, and Untitled Goose Game, released in 2019. And we'll talk about both projects today. House received a number of international accolades for both games, including Game of the Year at the 2020 Game Developers' Choice Awards, which is a pretty huge achievement, I reckon. So hello, hi Jake and Nico.
Hi Doug. Hi Doug. Hi everyone else.
Hello, thanks for being here. So just to set expectations for everyone, I'm going to treat this interview as like a fellow developer and not like a journalist. So I won't be needling them about their next project, what are you working on, or anything. I'm more interested in their previous work and their experience of getting to Goose Game. So to start, I want to discuss some of your earlier history. Some of the popular press for Goose Game made it sound like that game kind of came out of nowhere, quote unquote. But I think it's important to talk about like all the team formation and work that preceded 2019. So remind us, how did the four of you initially meet before House existed?
This is always harder on video. Jake, do you want to take this one or?
Go for it if you.
Okay, so the four of us started hanging out as a group in about 2013. We'd all known each other for a while, but started seriously spending time together because we needed 4 people to play all these interesting local multiplayer games that have been coming out. So we were just finding these games on the internet, things like Samurai Gun and Nidhogg, and lots of them needed exactly 4 people to play. So we started getting together as a group of 4 and kind of just sitting on the couch and playing these games. And then afterwards talking about how exciting it was that small teams were making these things that were really fun to play together, and kind of getting critically engaged, talking a lot about what we liked about these games and what we thought was working, what might else work in a space like this. So we kind of became our little video game club. And then we all had some free time at the end of that year that overlapped. So we decided to try making a video game together. We didn't have a heap of video game making experience, like little bits and pieces of relevant things here and there. But we thought we'd give something a go. And at the very least, we thought we could make something that we could get our friends to play. Like that was our kind of guaranteed audience, which would really work with a local multiplayer game because they're meant to be played socially. So we got together, started making something, and that's how we began making Push Me Pull You, which became our first video game as House.
Great. And Can you talk a little bit more? So you mentioned that you maybe hadn't made so many video games before. What kind of formal tech and also arts training do the four of you have?
So I went to film school, and Stuart and Michael both did fine art degrees. I think part of film school for me was like, learning just like how to use incredibly complex editing software. And so going from that into like game engines and things didn't feel so like too alienating. But beyond that, like I think Nico probably has the most specialized skills as I would see it. I think my and Michael and Stuart's skills are more just like being pretty good at Photoshop and like pretty good at talking things through and like having an aesthetic sensibility or something like, but before really we started to jump in, I don't think we really knew anything. Like Nico, you should probably talk about your like explicit programming experience.
Yeah, so the other three had this kind of art school backgrounds. I'd been trying a few different things. I knew I was interested in making video games, but never quite found a way in, and then started making drawing tools that were usable in the browser, that were like exploring recursive drawing and things like that. And eventually one of them kind of became a puzzle game. And I was very happy that I kind of stumbled into making a video game and learning how to program one as this little project that I'd just been doing for myself. And that was what gave me the confidence that if the four of us got together, well, I could do the programming with this little bit that I'd learned by making a small puzzle game. And that kind of was enough that we figured, okay, look, everyone knows how to make some art and one of us knows how to do a bit of programming. I'm sure we'll be able to get through this. But working with the other three, I think it was very apparent that you all had this really clear way of talking critically about what you liked and didn't like and what was working for you about different media that you're into, which was something that I didn't have any experience with. Like, I think that kind of art school crit thing really came through and was something that I had to learn a lot about from you all.
Yeah, I feel like even definitely with the fine art degrees, like Michael and Stuart are so much more better trained in that as well. Like I think I sort of had kind of, I don't know, somewhere in between the experience, because we did that sort of crit, but it wasn't as like, I think kind of rigorous and formalized as it is in like explicit art degrees. In film school, we did that like, maybe once a semester we'd all get together and talk about our films. But so much of filmmaking is about production, and there wasn't really the time to even like do the same kind of reflection that you get to do constantly in a fine art degree.
I definitely felt like our process making Push Me Pull You, we were very, very slow at any of the technical doing. Like actually making something would take us forever, but we were pretty good at talking about what we were going to make. So by the time we decided to make something, we were reasonably confident that it was the right choice.
Great. I have a few other questions about the kind of history of that project. But first, to kind of get everyone on the same page, let's watch one of your video trailers for Push Me Pull You, just so that everyone kind of can see what the game is. Here, if the folks at ACMI would be kind enough to cue it up, here is the quote unquote playbook trailer. Excellent. So Can you tell us a little bit more about what we just watched for people who haven't played Push Me Pull You? So like, give us the quick summary. What is this game?
So it's a 4-player sports game where you play on a team with someone else against another pair. And you and your partner are connected by the waist body that you get to grow and shrink. And you use this body to control a ball or balls in these play fields.
So you're wrestling for control of a ball against another team who are also a big, long, wiggly person.
And because you're connected, you need to work together because your actions affect your partner. And so it sort of enforces coordination and enforces teamwork.
Now, you mentioned some of the like origin stories of getting together to work on this project, but can you tell us a little bit more about your explicit influences? Like particular, I seem to remember Nobi Nobi Boy was a big influence on this game. Is that correct? Like, tell us more about some of the both games and maybe non-games things that you were pulling from when you made Push Me Pull You.
Pretty explicitly, very inspired by so the Sports Friends series, which you headed up along with 3 others, Doug. So there's the game Hokra in Sports Friends, which is like a 4-player soccer game, which is just very pared back ball control in a 2v2 setting. And we'd been playing that game a lot, and we're very interested in like what sort of ways could this dynamic be changed up. And one of our favorite games of all time was Nobi Nobi Boy, which is a PlayStation 3 game that doesn't get played enough, where you play as a big tube monster and control the head and tail of the tube separately. And we thought it would be interesting if the people in this sports game were tied together in the same way that tube monster worked. And I think Stuart drew a picture of 2 people tied together, I guess sharing a torso, and they obviously weren't getting along as they were trying to play the game. And the second we saw that, we realized how funny this dynamic was, that if you had to do everything together, you might instantly end up getting in the way of each other and having a kind of intimacy with the teammate that could be both fun, but also maybe a bit of a bother.
Now, so the 4 of you kind of getting together, not so much experience in the video game industry, cobbling together this game out of whatever technical knowledge you had, your kind of art and design discussions around it. How did you like get from this very informal friends jamming together, making this game, to this like commercial game release on PlayStation? Like what was your first foothold into the Melbourne and the international kind of games scene and industry?
I was looking back at emails for some reason in the last like month. And like, I don't know, I think we had a model of the indie developer as being someone who has a blog and someone who sort of publicizes their work through like the practice of kind of I guess sharing their experience in development and kind of, you know, doing blog updates and showing people what's going on with your game. And that was how I got into indie games, and how Nico and I shared like our passion for indie games, I think very early on in like 2008, 2009, when sort of capital I indie was starting to kick off in a bigger way. And so when we started to make a game, I think we just sort of naturally thought that, oh, we should make a blog. We should have a space that people can find the game and see some pictures or something. So we made this Tumblr that had GIFs of the game on it. We made a Twitter, and very quickly, like, I guess this was just a really exciting time in games when it wasn't so big that it was overwhelming, but there was sort of a real flourishing of all this stuff like happening. And you could still be the kind of person who really paid attention and found lots of the new stuff. Like, I don't think you could do it now because there's so much stuff coming out all the time, constantly. But some people from the UK and the US found our blog somehow And we started making the game mid-December of 2013. And in February of 2014, a PlayStation rep sent us an email saying, hey, are you interested in putting a game on PlayStation? And we were completely floored by it. We had no idea what that meant. And we kind of thought it was a scam. We had to check whether this person was real. But I think that very early kick in that direction just sort of made us start to see ourselves as more legitimate game developers, and we started to like explore some avenues that I don't think we would have had we just kept muddling on alone. So that like pushed us towards getting a Film Victoria grant, because we couldn't sell a game to PlayStation if we weren't a business. And then that sort of began this sort of snowballing effect where we just sort of kept becoming more and more legitimate by like patchwork. We got another email from the Wild Rumpus people who were putting on a party at GDC, the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, and they wanted to show the game at this party. So that again, like, made us feel more legitimate, made us feel like we could actually do this thing. And that process just like continued over the next 3 years until we finally released a commercial game.
I think if someone had said when we started that summer, like, this would be 3 years of your life, I don't know what I would have done. But knowing that every step of the way, we're just like, oh, this seems like a nice opportunity. Sure, we'll do this. And I guess we'll have to work a bit more on it to get it good enough to be, I don't know, at a GDC party, or get it a little bit better so that we can try and get a Film Victoria grant. Taking one step at a time, but always being open to new opportunities as they came. Let it become a bigger project as we became more confident and could cope with that happening.
Yeah, like when we first started making the game that December, we were sort of making it for our friends to play it at the end of that month. So we spent like 3 weeks making the first prototype for the game, and that could have been the end of it as far as we were concerned. Like, that was a nice enough kind of, I don't know, we had a sense of completion or something just for having our friends play it. But things just kept sort of rolling on, and that goalpost just kept shifting little by little.
Great. And so I want to talk a little bit more too about the game Push Me Pull You itself. A few years ago, Jake, you wrote this blog post that I really like called Where is Pimpy Played? And I think we'll have the ACMI staff link this in the chat. In this blog post, you talked about the inherent like Australianness of Push Me Pull You. You wrote, and I quote, I also wanted to capture a certain Australianness in the environments while avoiding the obvious signifiers and caricature. And so I don't know if everyone could hear in the trailer that we just played, but I personally really appreciate the like unmistakable Australian accents of the children yelling those playbook names in that trailer. Now, was this Melbourne-ness kind of flavor of Push Me Pull You a conscious design goal throughout the project at the beginning of the project? Or was that something kind of more unintentional that you reflected on later on?
I definitely wouldn't say it was conscious amongst all of us. Like, I think Push Me Pull You, we saw it, I think, quite early on as being a kind of community sport. Like, we talked about and joked about the idea of the people that you play as in the game, they watch professionals on TV in Push Me Pull You world. Like, in the world of Push Me Pull You, there are professionals somewhere, but you, the player, you, Doug, me, we don't get to play as them. We're playing as just like the suburban kids who go out into the street and play sport together. And I think we wanted to capture that level of sport and competition, because that felt a lot nicer as a thing to do, I guess, you know, amongst four friends on the couch. It felt like the right kind of tone for us. And so I was inspired by this student game called Movement Study 1 from RMIT, actually, which was made by Marigold Bartlett, Sam Crisp, Alexander Perrin, Adrian Owen, and Jamie. Jamie Anderson. And it was just this like a game set in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. And I was just really like taken by the fact that all the buildings in the game looked like things that I recognized and looked like these, Brunswick brick houses and stuff. And like that felt really special that they were capturing this specific space that I recognized. And so when it came time to put environments in the game for Push Me Pull You, I just turned to things that felt familiar, and that felt like a little special thing for me to like try and capture things from my life and put it into the game, for no particular reason beyond just like having it feel a bit special, I think, really.
Yeah, I think the ACMI staff is about to put, can we put that beach picture on the screen for everyone to see, just to like emphasize this subtle or not so subtle Australianness of the game. Jake, were the color palettes kind of also as well, along with the kind of topography or what you were referencing, where like artistically, was that a key part of kind of capturing that backyard Australian feel?
I think the colors were really just what would look good against these bodies that we had. We were sort of pretty constrained technically. Like I think that like that beach setting is Cape Patterson to me. It's probably Cape Patterson to no one else, but I think that sort of thing would have just come out naturally from the subject, or from the reference rather than a specific like conscious choice.
Okay, so that's Push Me Pull You. We could obviously talk about that a lot longer, but I also want to talk about your next commercial project, Untitled Goose Game, which was released 3 years later. Now, again, in case people haven't seen this game, let's watch the 2018 announcement trailer for Untitled Goose Game, just to get an idea of what it is. What were your main influences? Like, where did the idea originate? And maybe while you answer that, the kind folks at ACMI can show Michael's tweet about an infamous Slack conversation as we talk.
So it really did start. The first I knew about a goose game was when Stuart posted that picture in Slack. Obviously, that's a very funny stock photograph. A goose is a very funny animal. And we couldn't help but notice all the different funny things about a goose. I mean, looking at this now, like after just having that conversation before about how a fine arts background makes people talk in a certain way, I think that the kind of endless critiquing of things kind of has become so core to how we all talk to each other now that we can't talk about a goose without getting pretty into why a goose is funny. But we had this conversation about why a goose is an intrinsically funny animal. And then the next time that we all got together in person, we started making up and doing a little bit of research about it turns out people are really scared of geese. Imagine a game where you're the scary goose and everyone's afraid of you. And we kind of talked about a town that was all running away while a goose was on a bit of a rampage, and how that could be a funny video game idea. But I don't think we necessarily thought a heap of it at that point. Like, game ideas are easy. They come and go. But while we were at the end of Push Me Pull You and looking at other things to make and even working on a little prototype of something else, the goose game idea just kind of got bigger and more appealing every time we thought about it. Like it kind of did make a weird amount of sense for such a silly idea that you'd get to play as this goose. And then after a while, I remember one afternoon where we just sat down and said, look, what we're working on at the moment, these prototypes aren't really going anywhere. What if we just try and make the goose game? And even if that turns out to be too big or too weird or falls apart, at least it'll be funny to work on for a while. And then we started making the goose game. I think within like a week, Jake had modeled that goose and it looks pretty much the same in the finished game. And we just never stopped adding things to the goose game and didn't look back. In terms of specific influences, to answer the other part of your question, the things that we'd been specifically interested in that kind of led up to us making the goose game, which kind of didn't come out of nowhere, was we really wanted to make this third person character that you could kind of puppet around in this performative way. Like maybe for someone who's sitting next to you on the couch, you can make them move in an interesting way. We'd been playing a lot of Mario 64, and Mario 64, there's a lot of weird moves that you normally don't get to see. Like you can make Mario crawl around on the ground like a baby if you hold the right buttons. Like I think you have to tilt the stick just the right amount, but not too much. And you can have a lot of fun just performing Mario like he's a little, player, and the people on the couch are your audience. So we kind of wanted to make a game that felt a bit like that. And we'd also been very interested in the idea of filling a game with lots of everyday objects, like things that you might find in your house, 3D modeled, and you get to go and play with them and push them around as physics objects and stuff. So I think one of the reasons why the goose idea was appealing was because it gave a lot of context to this particular goals that we had of being this third person performative character who got to interact with a bunch of everyday objects.
Mm.
And can I clarify? So what were your 4 exact roles on Goose Game? And you had some collaborators as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like who worked on Goose Game?
We always kind of shy away from the direct roles question because we feel like the most important stuff that we do in making the game is kind of talking and conversation, and we design everything together and make all the big decisions together. Like we all kind of working with the tools, like working with Unity and working with these sort of more complex things, we did eventually sort of slot more into like maybe more official like industry roles. Like making Push Me Pull You was a total mess, and we just like did whatever we felt, whatever we were interested in was the thing that you got to like have a go at doing. So thinking about all the different things that each of us did in that game is really kind of like full on. It's just like, oh, you touched this and that, and like you both worked on that together, and like it was a real
like a conveyor belt line where each of us was in the line about 7 times.
Yeah.
Repeated.
But so yeah, working with tools like Unity and Blender and what's the music one? Fmod. Like these things are specialized enough that you kind of do need to start to slot into these kind of, more industry accepted roles. Although the important stuff we do is still just talking. But so like Nico said, like I made the goose at the very start, but then I eventually started working more on environments, and I did a lot of the level design, or like, the actual act of placing it in Unity and modeling them in Blender. And Stuart did most of the animation and modeled most of the characters with lots of Michael's input. Michael is like I think Michael's the person that whenever I need something to look good and I'm just not happy with it, I'll go, Michael, can you make this good now? And he like has done all the UI and a lot of the like the flat design.
And
Nico
lots of the art direction as well, like setting the initial style. Like he sketched these people that don't have faces and kind of set the initial color palette and stuff.
And Nico did all the programming, all the complicated stuff.
Yeah, but then we did work with a bunch of collaborators as well outside of the 4 of us. So the music was done by Dan Golding, who also did the music for Push Me Pull You. So he made the adapted Debussy that you hear in the game. as well as the different music that plays on the radio. And we worked with Colonica, who did extra art and animation. And one of the most valuable things Colonica did was she made this big presentation of all the crimes in the Goose Game and went through them one by one and told us why it was ugly. And she was spot on about all of them and got us to fix a bunch of them, which was invaluable. Kind of like art consultant who could come in and kind of push it all to the next level, as well as actually doing a lot of the work for particularly like foliage and some of the animations. Cherie Davidson, who did a lot of it, programming around settings and accessibility options. So there's like rebindable controls in the game that allow a lot of people to play who wouldn't be able to play otherwise. And she's responsible for all of that. M. Helberstadt did the sound design for the game, which is all amazing. M's from Vancouver. And every now and then, M would send us a photograph that was just basically a scene from the game. They'd gotten all of the different props and put them in the backyard and banged on them all one by one and pretended to pick them up and drop them. And everything you hear in the game, most of that was just in M's backyard at some point. And who am I forgetting, Jake? We also worked with Panic, who published the game. And then we worked with a porting company as well, who did a bunch of work at the end to get it to run on PlayStation and Xbox and Switch effectively.
Cool. I just wanted to note, we are going to try to get to some of the viewer questions in just a little bit. I want to ask just a couple more questions before we do that. So I know the team, and specifically Jake did a lot of this, did a bunch of research into British villages while working on the level design and the concepts of the world. So this is like definitely a contrast to the more explicit Australianness of Push Me Pull You. Can you tell us about the importance of that research, Jake, and the whole team, and how you went about doing it?
Yeah. In terms of the importance, I think for me it felt, I guess, just representing another space that was real to millions of people, like in terms of just the population of Britain. Like I felt a responsibility that I needed to do it justice, and that like my goal became, if we were going to be Australians setting a game in a place that we didn't live in, that I would try and do my very best to like capture some degree of authenticity as best as I could. And the way that I went about it was by, I've never been to the UK. I've watched, the game came out of a lot of like British kids TV shows that we grew up with. Like I think that was sort of a big touchstone for us. But yeah, in terms of actually doing research and actually like making sure that I felt like I was doing, the best authentic job that I could, I just got onto Google Maps and Street View a lot. And I would kind of trawl around Street View looking for references and looking for as many different like examples of the thing that I was trying to produce in situ, until I felt like I'd sort of developed a kind of like literacy for like how spaces fit together in these places, and like what made sense, and like what materials worked, and what those materials and placement and their relation to the things around them, like what that said about the space we're in. And so, yeah, I just found a whole bunch of different villages that I liked in the UK, and would just zoom down and troll around in Street View, like trying to find things that I could use as reference. And I sort of, my kind of, my general approach was to not put anything in the game unless I could find something that like spoke to it from the real world. Like I really didn't want to just like make something up or like sneak in some fake Australianism that a whole bunch of people in the UK would go, what? That's not how this thing works.
By the way, in the background, I think we have ACMI showing this wonderful poster drawing for your physical release done by local artist Goldie Bartlett, which is really nice to see this kind of new visual representation of your level design, your world building.
Working with Goldie was such a treat, and she did such a good job with this thing. And just like being able to see our world reimagined was such a nice surprise so late in the game.
I had so much more that I could ask that I want to ask. I have just one more question, and then I really should take some viewer questions. So now, despite the like explicit Britishness of Untitled Goose Game, it feels like your Melbourne, Australian context like kept leaking through the project in a couple of ways. So a lot of players noted the acknowledgement of country that you put into the credits. Maybe if the ACMI folks could show the screenshot of that while we talk. You've also been vocal on social media about donating some of your earnings to pay the rent and other Indigenous initiatives. Can you tell us about the importance of reconciling the work on the game itself with your local context here in Melbourne and kind of politics around
that? So obviously the House office that we benefit from is on stolen land. And we benefit from that, but sovereignty was never ceded, and Indigenous people are still fighting the legacy of all of that today. So it's important to acknowledge that and then to take steps to try and help that situation. I don't know if we're the best at talking about it, but it's certainly a thing that everyone can do. So Pay the Rent asks people to donate 1% of their income to Indigenous-run groups.
Great, yeah. Thanks. I just thought that was I think a lot of people were really surprised and pleasantly surprised to see that kind of explicitly in the credits for the game. So I hope that does create some precedents for future games. So we have about 10 minutes left. So let's at least take a few questions from our viewers. We've had a few people ask, was the title always going to be Untitled Goose Game? Like, why not just Goose Game or some other title? Can you say a little bit about that?
So it's called Untitled Goose Game because we didn't have a title. We didn't want people to think that Goose Game was going to be the name of the game. So we had to make a very obvious placeholder-y sounding name. Ideally, we would have come up with the actual name before announcing, but for whatever reason, that didn't work out. We had to put it in a festival. It was going to be out there. We had to make sure that everyone knew that the name was just a placeholder. So we thought if we put the word Untitled there, everyone would know there's no way that the game is actually going to ship with the name Untitled Goose Game. And then that trailer got like 500,000 views very quickly, and we realized, oh, everyone knows our game as Untitled Goose Game. So I guess that's happening now. But it turned out to be pretty good. Like, I don't think you'd be able to Google Goose Game anyway. There's an old board game that has that name. So Untitled Goose Game it is.
I think we couldn't find anything funny or that didn't like step on the joke a little bit too much. And so it just turned out to be the best. It was best to keep it unnamed.
Excellent. I personally am quite pleased that you stuck with that name, by the way. We have a couple questions from a while ago about Push Me Pull You that I don't want to neglect. So 2 questions. Did you post on your blog on a regular basis while you were developing Push Me Pull You? And then is the first prototype of Push Me Pull You available anywhere?
Oh. In terms of posting on the blog, we hate doing marketing. We hate doing social media. We hate the blog. It's a real chore. And we try to do it as little as possible. And we try to focus all our energies into as big a thing as we could. So now we mostly just focus it into trailers. And we try to just make sure that whatever we do is as kind of, loud and effective as possible. And back then, I think I don't know, you can look at the blog. I think it's blog.pumpygame.com, and you can see or it might be pumpygame.com/blog, but you can see how often we posted. And every time it was sort of a real chore to do. And I think we'd have to like drag ourselves into it.
I think we were just trying out to see what it was like. Like we didn't know that we weren't going to like writing blog posts. We thought, oh, we'll make a blog and maybe that'll be fun too. And other people have them and it seems okay. But I think as time went on, we got more confident that it was okay not to do everything. Like we learned what we liked doing, what we didn't like doing, and began to believe that, no, it'll be okay. We don't have to do a blog for the next game. It turns out we don't like doing that and we can put that energy elsewhere. Whereas at the start, there was more of a feeling of like, oh, do you have to do everything that they say when you look up a how to make a video game guide? Because most of them say have a blog or something. Maybe that's less true these days, but I think back in 2013, everyone was really pushing that you should have a blog for your game. So that was definitely something that we made ourselves do until we figured out that we didn't have to. The prototype, I didn't answer that question. Not that I'm aware of, but it might be. It might even be there, but unlisted on the internet or something.
Whoa.
I'll let the detectives figure that out.
It's like a ARG. I love it. Another question about Pimpy. This quality of I want it to be played by my friends. So the question is, do you feel like that quality shows in the final product? And if so, how did it become different compared to similar games that started out with more ambition?
I think that that's a pretty core thing to everything that we do. Like we have obviously lots of friends who are game developers these days, but particularly when we were starting out, we've had friends who didn't necessarily have a heap of game literacy and we wanted them to play the things that we were making. Maybe they weren't comfortable holding a controller or hadn't played many games that were similar. But we wanted them to be able to play our games too. So we really prioritized making sure that this game was very easy to play for those people, like didn't have too many buttons, all the things that you were meant to do were really obvious. Not necessarily always successfully, but I think we got to a pretty good place in the end. And then it turned out that not only were these friends that we had in mind who weren't necessarily the kinds of people who'd normally download indie games from the internet could play our game, but also a bunch of other people who didn't necessarily have a heap of video game experience could play the game too. And with a local multiplayer game, that turned out to be really valuable because most people don't have 4 hardcore video game players in their household, but they might have themselves and some family members or some neighbors or something who might be interested enough that they'll give something a go, particularly if it's easy or easy to pick up. I should rather than not necessarily easy the whole way through. So that meant it was easier for people to get this group of 4. It wasn't too intimidating for you to just rope someone else in and say, no, just give it a try. You'll probably enjoy it. And I'd say that is something that we learned a lot about, particularly because you could play Push Me, Pull You in public. So we'd watch people, members of the public, come up and maybe they're a bit intimidated grabbing the controller for the first time, but then they're enjoying it for a little while and then they get confused and put it down and walk away and you go, okay, why did that person get confused? And you build up a bit of an intuition about what these non-traditional video game players will put up with or what they need or what will keep them interested. And that became something that we kept valuing even through the Goose Game. So the Goose Game wasn't a local multiplayer game that would get played in public. It didn't need this big group, but it was kind of a game that you'd play for an audience, and the audience sitting next to you might not necessarily have a heap of video game experience. So if you're playing that and your household will gather around on the couch, you want to make sure it's funny for them and makes sense to them. So we had kind of the same process of making sure that the game was very understandable to these non-players who were watching along. And I think that experience making a multiplayer game for friends who didn't play video games definitely helped make a video game that was about performing for people, even if they hadn't played a heap of video games.
And let's keep going in that Goose Game direction. We had a question: was it hard to know when the game Untitled Goose Game was done? How did you know the game was done or not?
I mean, we had sort of more realistic deadlines. I think we knew it was done because we made the ending. I think.
I think we built it up for a while, and we just kept adding things and adding things and adding things, and then it got to a point where we were like, "All right, this feels like heaps. This is more than we ever thought we were going to add to this game. Let's just try and make the bits that are in here now good." And then it took us the rest of the time just to get those bits good and make sure there was an ending and people weren't getting stuck at level 2 or something. So once we were confident that people would consistently play through start to end and it was the good experience every time, we knew that we were finished. The harder thing was probably knowing when it was time to start finishing, if that makes sense. Finishing the finishing was easy, but knowing that it was time to stop adding new bits to the game, which was kind of halfway through development, that kind of was just more of a gut thing of like, this many areas feels like a good amount. We've bitten off enough here that we shouldn't bite off anymore.
Yeah, even then we still had some things in the pipeline that we had to cut. Like, so we just, finishing became more important than adding in those extra bits.
Right.
We did? I'm going to ask you later what they were. I've forgotten all about it.
Unfortunately, that's probably this like idea of finishing is probably a good note to end this session on as well. There's lots of other questions in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to that. So much to ask you about in just 50 minutes to do it with. But there will be future sessions with other developers, which I'll talk about in just a second. Thank you, Jake and Nico, for joining us. Big round of applause. And
thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
thanks, Doug.
Thank you to ACMI for co-hosting as well. Next week, this time, 6 p.m. Melbourne time, we'll have Nak Vu from Melbourne studio Route 59 to talk about their new game, Necrobarista. So that's also going to be a really great session, so don't miss that. And finally, if you are watching this recording in the future, check out these other ACMI videos here that will be linked, presumably in the recorded version. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jake and Nico.